There is a bed described in one of the oldest books in the world. It is not described in a legend or a myth or a forgotten scroll. It is described in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, in a verse that pauses almost in passing to record a strange and specific detail. It says that there was a bedstead made of iron, and it gives the measurements: 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Do the arithmetic, and the number that comes back is staggering. That bed, by the common reckoning, was around 13 feet long. 13 feet, longer than most rooms you have ever stood in. And the text records it specifically because it belonged to a man. It was his bed. It was built to hold his body. And if the bed was 13 feet long, then the man who slept in it was a giant beyond anything we can easily picture. His name was Og, king of Bashan. You have heard of Goliath, the giant of Gath, the champion, the shepherd boy struck down with a stone. Goliath is famous. Goliath is the giant everyone knows. But Goliath, by the measurements the tradition gives, would have looked up at Og. Og was older. Og was a king, not a mere champion. Og ruled a whole land, with cities and armies and a throne. And Og belonged to a race, an ancient people the text calls the Rephaim, the last survivor of a bloodline of giants that reached back to the very beginning of the world, before the flood. Before the flood. Hold on to those words because they contain the strangest and most impossible part of this entire story, because there was a flood, the great deluge that in the tradition God sent to drown a corrupted world and wipe it clean. And the flood had a specific purpose in the deepest layers of the tradition. It was meant to destroy a particular kind of being, the giants, the offspring of a forbidden union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, the Nephilim and all their monstrous kind. The flood came to erase them from the earth, to end the age of giants in a world drowned and remade. And yet, generations later, when Moses led his people toward the promised land, there was Og, a giant, a king of the Rephaim, a living descendant of the very bloodline the flood was supposed to have destroyed. Standing in his kingdom, sleeping in his enormous iron bed, ruling his land of giants, as if the great drowning had never touched him at all. How? How could a giant of the old bloodline still be alive, still be reigning after the flood that was meant to end his kind forever? The tradition felt that question. It felt it as a problem, a contradiction at the heart of its own story. And it answered with one of the most extraordinary legends ever told. It said that Og survived the flood, that when the waters rose and the world drowned, Og did not drown with it, that he clung to the outside of Noah's ark, riding out the deluge on the roof of the very vessel built to save the righteous, while every other giant on earth perished in the waves, that Noah himself kept him alive, feeding him through a hole in the side of the ark, as the last giant of the old world floated above the drowned earth, a giant who survived the flood, a relic of the world before carried alive into the world after, the last of his kind, reigning in a land of the dead until the day he met Moses in battle and the age of giants finally, truly came to its end. Is it history? Is it legend? Is it the memory of something real, swollen and transformed in the retelling? Tonight, we are going to follow the last giant king through every layer of his story, through the text that names him, the bed that measures him, the war that killed him, and the impossible legend that kept him alive through the drowning of the world. We are going to separate what the scripture says from what the legend added, and both from what modern imagination has built on top of them. And we are going to ask what it means that a whole tradition insisted, against its own logic, that one giant escaped the flood. Who was Og of Bashan, and why could the age of giants not end without him? Welcome. Ask anyone to name a giant, and you will almost always get the same answer: Goliath, the towering Philistine champion who strode out between the armies day after day, hurling his challenge until a shepherd boy named David felled him with a sling and a single stone. It is one of the most famous stories ever told, and Goliath has become, in our imagination, the giant, the very definition of the word, the great enemy brought low. But Goliath was not the first giant of the tradition, nor the largest, nor the most mysterious. He was, in a sense, the last famous one, a straggler, a remnant, appearing late in the story when the great age of giants was already almost over. Behind him, older and stranger and far larger, stands a figure most people have never heard of, though he is named again and again in the same scriptures that gave us Goliath. A king, not a champion. The ruler of a whole land of giants, the last survivor of an ancient race, a being so large that the tradition remembered the very dimensions of his bed, and so old that it claimed he had lived through the flood itself. His name was Og, king of Bashan, and he is the giant that history forgot. This documentary is the story of that forgotten giant, and it is a richer and stranger story than Goliath's, because Og sits at the very center of the deepest mysteries of the whole tradition of giants. He is bound up with the Rephaim, the ancient race of giants. He is bound up with the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God. He is bound up with the flood and with the haunting question of what survived it. And he is bound up with the conquest of the promised land, standing as the last great obstacle, the final giant king, whose fall marked the closing of an age. To follow Og is to follow the entire arc of the giants, from their origins before the flood to their end in the wars of Moses, through the life of a single named king who somehow spanned all of it. But before we begin that journey, I have to be honest with you about what kind of story this is, because this subject, more than almost any other, is built in layers, and the whole meaning of it depends on keeping those layers clear. There are 3 of them, and we are going to move through all 3, and I am going to tell you at every step which one we are standing in, because the difference between them is the difference between what a text actually says, what later legend added to it, and what modern imagination has built on top of both. The first layer is the biblical text itself, and here I want to be precise because it matters. Og is not a figure invented by conspiracy theorists or dreamed up in the modern age. Og is genuinely, unmistakably present in the Hebrew Bible. He appears in the book of Numbers, in the account of Israel's journey. He appears repeatedly in the book of Deuteronomy, where his defeat is recounted and where that famous bed is described. He appears in the book of Joshua, in the division of the conquered land. He is referenced in the Psalms, remembered in the songs of Israel as one of the great kings struck down. Og is woven all through the scriptures, a recurring figure the text treats as real, a king defeated in a remembered war. When we talk about the biblical Og, we are talking about a genuine feature of one of the foundational texts of Western civilization, not a fringe invention. That is the solid ground, the first layer, the text as it stands. Now, whether the biblical Og corresponds to a real historical king, and whether he was truly a giant, are separate questions, and we will treat them honestly in their place. The text being real does not make everything it says literally true, but the text is the anchor, the starting point, the thing that is genuinely there, and it is far more than most people realize. The Bible really does describe a giant king named Og, really does record the dimensions of his iron bed, really does call him the last of the Rephaim. That is where we begin. The second layer is legend, and this is where the story becomes truly wild, and where we have to be most careful, because the most extraordinary claims about Og, the ones that make this subject so irresistible, are not in the Bible at all. The story of Og surviving the flood by clinging to the ark, the story of Noah feeding him through a hole, the story of Og as a descendant of the fallen angels reaching back before the deluge. These come not from the biblical text, but from later Jewish tradition, from the vast body of rabbinic writing, the Talmud and the Midrash, composed centuries after the scriptures themselves. This is a rich, ancient, fascinating body of legend and interpretation, and it added to the figure of Og an entire mythology that the Bible never contained. When we reach those stories, and we will in all their strangeness, I am going to be clear that we have crossed from the text into the legend, from what the scripture says to what later tradition dreamed. Both are worth exploring, but they are not the same, and pretending the Ark story is biblical when it is rabbinic legend is exactly the kind of blurring this documentary refuses to do. The third layer is modern speculation. This is the world of the surviving bloodline, the Nephilim genetic line, the global race of giants, the idea that Og is evidence of a hidden lineage of superhuman beings threaded through history. These ideas draw on the text and the legend, but they extend far beyond both into territory that neither the scripture nor the ancient rabbis would recognize. And when we reach that layer in the later parts of our journey, I will treat it as what it is, modern speculation built on ancient material, presented in its full imaginative force, but examined with a clear and honest eye. So that is our method, and it is the thing that separates this from the endless shallow retellings of the giant legends. We will present each layer in its strongest, most vivid form. We will let you feel the full weight and wonder of the story, the 13-foot bed, the giant on the ark, the last king of the Rephaim, and then honestly, we will examine it, asking what is text and what is legend, what the words actually mean, what the evidence actually supports, and what the recurring dream of giants is really telling us. We will neither swallow the legend whole nor dismiss it with a wave of the hand. We will take it seriously enough to understand it truly. And at the center of it all is that one impossible question, the question that will run through this entire documentary like a thread, the question the tradition itself could not avoid. The flood was meant to end the giants, so how was there still a giant king generations later for Moses to fight? That contradiction is not a modern invention. It is embedded in the tradition's own story, and the legend of Og surviving the flood is the tradition's own desperate, brilliant answer to it. Understanding that is the key that unlocks the whole mystery of the last giant king. Here is the road ahead. We will begin with the biblical Og, the king of Bashan, as the text presents him, establishing who he was and where he ruled and what the scripture actually says. We will examine the famous bed of iron, the strange specific detail that has fascinated readers for millennia, and we will do the honest work of asking what it really tells us. We will explore the Rephaim, Og's ancient race, and the whole world of giant clans the text describes. Then we will cross into legend, into the extraordinary story of how Og survived the flood, and we will uncover the deep problem that legend was created to solve. We will follow Og to his final battle against Moses at Edrei, the fall of the last giant king. We will trace the bloodline of the Nephilim from the origins before the flood to the giants of the promised land. We will widen our view to the giants of the whole world and weigh them honestly. And we will arrive at last at the end of the age of giants and ask what it all means. The giant that history forgot deserves to be remembered in full, in all three of his layers, text and legend and dream. So let us begin where the tradition begins, with the king in his land, before the legends grew around him. Let us meet Og of Bashan as the scripture first presents him, the last of the Rephaim, the king in the land of giants. To meet the real Og, the Og of the text, we have to set aside, for now, everything the legends would later add. Forget the ark, forget the flood, forget the fallen angels and the surviving bloodline. Strip all of that away and go back to the figure as the biblical text first presents him, because that figure is remarkable enough on his own, and everything else was built on top of him. So who is Og in the scripture itself? He is a king. That is the first and most fundamental thing. Og is not a wandering monster, not a lone brute haunting the wilderness. He is a sovereign, the ruler of a kingdom, with cities and territory and an army under his command. The text presents him as a political power, a king to be reckoned with, standing in the path of Israel as they journeyed toward the promised land. And his kingdom had a name, a real place, a land east of the Jordan River. He was Og, king of Bashan. Bashan is a genuine region, and understanding it helps ground the whole story. It lay to the east of the Jordan, a land known in antiquity as fertile and formidable, a high country of rich pasture and dark volcanic rock. Its cattle and its oak trees were proverbial, remembered in the poetry of the Bible as symbols of strength and abundance. The bulls of Bashan, the oaks of Bashan, these were bywords for power and might. It was a land with a certain reputation, a place of strength, and it was over this land that Og ruled from his royal cities. The text names them. He reigned in Ashtaroth and in Edrei, his seats of power, the centers of his kingdom. These were real cities in a real region, and Og is presented as their king. Now let us look at how the text introduces him in the narrative, because the framing is significant. Og appears at a specific moment in the story of Israel. The people, led by Moses, are moving through the lands east of the Jordan in the final stage of their long journey out of Egypt and toward the Promised Land. They have just faced and defeated another king, Sihon, king of the Amorites, in battle. And immediately after that victory, they turn and go up a road, and there, waiting for them, is Og. The king of Bashan comes out against them, he and all his people, to do battle. Og enters the story as the next great obstacle, the next king in the path, a military threat rising up to block Israel's way. And there is a detail in how the text handles this moment that tells us Og was regarded as something more than an ordinary king, something more formidable, more frightening. Before the battle, according to the account, God speaks to Moses and says, "Do not fear him. Do not be afraid of Og." Now stop and consider that. Of all the kings and armies Israel faced, this is a moment where the narrative specifically records a divine reassurance not to be afraid. That reassurance implies something. It implies that Og was fearsome, that there was a reason to be afraid of him, a reason that had to be directly addressed and overcome. You do not need to be told not to fear an unremarkable enemy. The very presence of that reassurance signals that Og was no ordinary opponent, that he inspired a special dread, that there was something about this particular king that made even a victorious people hesitate. And what made Og so fearsome was the thing the tradition remembered most about him: his size, his nature, his descent from an ancient and terrible race. Because the text does not leave Og as merely a king, it marks him specifically and repeatedly as something more. It ties him to an ancient people, a race set apart from ordinary humanity. In the book of Deuteronomy, in the passage that describes his defeat, the text pauses to tell us something crucial about who Og was. It says that Og, king of Bashan, was the last remaining of the remnant of the Rephaim, the last of the Rephaim, the final survivor of an ancient race. That single phrase transforms Og from a regional king into something far more significant. The Rephaim, as we will explore fully in a later part of our journey, were, in the understanding of the tradition, a race of giants. An ancient people, larger than ordinary men, who had once inhabited the land and were remembered with awe and fear. And Og, the text tells us, was the last of them, the remnant of the remnant, the final surviving member of a race that was passing, or had already largely passed, out of the world. He was not just a king. He was a living relic of an older order, the last representative of a vanishing race of giants, ruling his kingdom in the twilight of his kind. Think about the weight the text gives him with that description. When Israel faced Og, they were not merely facing another Amorite king. They were facing the last of the Rephaim, the final giant king, a survivor from an ancient and formidable lineage. His defeat would not just be a military victory. It would be the extinguishing of a race, the closing of a chapter that reached back into the deep and legendary past. The text frames Og's fall as an event of real significance, the end of the Rephaim, the passing of the last of the old giants. And the scripture returns to Og again and again, which tells us how important a figure he was in the memory of Israel. His defeat is recounted in the book of Numbers as part of the journey. It is recounted again in more detail in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses recalls the victory and where the famous bed is described. It appears in the book of Joshua, where the conquered kingdom of Og is divided among the tribes, his land parceled out as an inheritance, and Og is remembered in the Psalms, in the songs of Israel, named alongside Sihon as one of the great kings whom God struck down, his defeat celebrated as a mark of divine deliverance, sung in worship generations later. Og was not a minor figure quickly forgotten. He was remembered, named, recounted, and sung about across multiple books, woven into the memory of Israel as one of the great enemies overcome on the road to the promised land. So this is the biblical Og, the figure of the first layer, before any legend was added. A king, the ruler of Bashan, seated in his cities of Ashtaroth and Edrei, a formidable enemy, so fearsome that the narrative records a divine reassurance not to be afraid of him. And above all, the last of the Rephaim, the final survivor of an ancient race of giants whose defeat marked the end of his kind. That is already an extraordinary figure, a giant king at the twilight of a legendary race, and it is all there in the text on the solid ground of the scripture itself. But of course, the detail that has fascinated readers for thousands of years, the detail that has made Og a figure of endless speculation, is the one we have only touched on so far, the bed. Because when the text tells us that Og was the last of the Rephaim, it offers, as if in proof, a single piece of physical evidence. It points to an object, a bed of iron of enormous size, which it says could still be seen, which it invites the reader to go and consider, 9 cubits long. A relic of the giant king, preserved and displayed, offered by the text itself as evidence of Og's staggering size. It is the closest thing the tradition gives us to a physical measurement of a giant, and it has launched 1,000 debates. Let us go and consider the bed of Og, as the text itself invites us to do, and ask what it truly tells us. There is a verse in the book of Deuteronomy that has fascinated, puzzled, and provoked readers for thousands of years. It comes right after the account of Og's defeat, and it has the quality of an aside, a narrator pausing to add a remarkable detail, almost as if anticipating the reader's disbelief. Having told us that Og was the last of the Rephaim, the text seems to want to prove it, to offer evidence, and the evidence it offers is an object, a bed. The verse tells us that Og's bedstead was a bedstead of iron, and it asks, is it not still to be seen? Is it not in a city of the people of Ammon? As if to say, if you doubt this, you can go and look. The relic survives, and then it gives the measurements, the numbers that have echoed down through the centuries. 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, by the cubit of a man. Let us sit with what the text is doing here, because it is remarkable. The narrator is offering physical evidence for the size of a giant. He is pointing to an artifact, a great iron bed, that he says still existed and could be viewed preserved in a foreign city, a relic of the fallen giant king. And he gives its dimensions precisely, inviting the reader to imagine the being who once slept in it. It is the closest thing in the entire tradition to a measurement of a giant, a specific numerical, physical claim about the size of Og. And that is exactly why it has been the focus of so much fascination. So let us do what readers have done for millennia. Let us do the arithmetic. The bed was 9 cubits long. A cubit, in the common ancient reckoning, was the length from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, roughly, in the standard estimate, about 1.5 feet, around 18 inches. 9 cubits, then, at 18 inches each, gives us a length of roughly 13.5 feet, and 4 cubits wide gives us about 6 feet in breadth, a bed 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. And if the bed was 13 feet long, then the man it was built for, allowing for a bed somewhat longer than its occupant, might have stood something like 9, 10, 11 feet tall or more, a giant by any reckoning, dwarfing even Goliath, who by the tradition's measurement stood around 9 feet or a little more. Og, on the evidence of the bed, was larger still, the largest giant the tradition ever measured. That is the claim in its full, staggering force, and I have given it to you straight because it deserves to be felt. A 13-foot bed, a king who needed it, the last of the Rephaim, measured by the relic he left behind. It is an astonishing image, and it has fired the imagination of everyone who has ever read it. Now, as we promised, we turn it over and we examine it honestly, because the bed of Og is the perfect place to establish how carefully this subject must be handled. And when you look closely, you find that this single verse raises a whole series of genuine questions, and that honest people, including devout scholars who take the text seriously, have wrestled with every one of them. The first question is the cubit itself. We casually converted 9 cubits to 13 feet, but the cubit was not a single fixed standardized unit like our modern meter. It varied. There were different cubits in the ancient world of different lengths, a common cubit and a longer royal cubit, and measures that differed from place to place and time to time. And crucially, the verse itself adds a curious qualifying phrase. It says, by the cubit of a man. By the cubit of a man. What does that mean? It may simply mean an ordinary standard cubit, a common man's forearm. But some have wondered whether it is a clarifying note precisely because the measurement might otherwise be misunderstood, and the exact length it intends is not as certain as our confident 13 feet suggests. Depending on which cubit you use, the bed's length shifts, and with it the size of its occupant. The arithmetic is only as solid as the unit, and the unit is not perfectly solid. The second question, and a deeper one, is whether the object was a bed at all, in the sense we imagine. The Hebrew word translated as bed or bedstead can carry that meaning, but words have ranges. and some scholars have argued that the object described might not have been a sleeping bed at all. One long-standing line of interpretation suggests that it may have been a sarcophagus, a great coffin or funerary bier, a burial monument rather than a piece of bedroom furniture. And this matters enormously because a sarcophagus is not the size of its occupant. A coffin, especially a grand royal one, is considerably larger than the body it holds, built with thick walls and ornamentation and space to spare. If the object was a great funerary sarcophagus rather than a literal bed, then its 13-foot length tells us far less about Og's actual height, because much of that length would be the monument itself, not the man. The third question concerns the material, iron. The text specifies a bedstead of iron, and that detail has drawn attention too. Some scholars have noted that the region of Bashan is a land of dark volcanic rock, of basalt, a heavy black stone that resembles iron in color and density and was abundant in exactly that area. And there is a real possibility, argued by serious interpreters, that the object was made not of the metal iron, but of this iron-like black basalt, a great sarcophagus or monument of dark volcanic stone of the kind genuinely found in that region. Such large basalt funerary monuments and dolmens do exist in the lands east of the Jordan, ancient stone structures and burial monuments of impressive size, and it is entirely possible that the tradition of Og's iron bed grew up around one of these real, imposing dark stone monuments, a great basalt sarcophagus or megalithic tomb that later generations associated with the legendary giant king. Put these questions together, and a very different and very interesting picture becomes possible. The object the text points to may not have been a bed, but a tomb. It may have been made not of metal, but of dark basalt stone, and its great size may reflect the dimensions of a grand funerary monument, rather than the literal body of a man. On this reading, the bed of Og is not a fabrication and not a lie. It is a real object, a genuine, imposing, ancient monument that existed and could be seen exactly as the text says. But it may be a monument that was interpreted by the tradition as the bed of a giant, its impressive size taken as proof of the size of the legendary king associated with it. The relic is real. The interpretation of it as a giant's bed is where the legend enters. And notice something important and honest here. This more sober reading does not simply dismiss the text. It takes it seriously. It accepts that there really was an impressive object, that the verse is pointing to something real that could be viewed. It simply asks what that object most likely was, and suggests that a great basalt burial monument of the kind that genuinely existed in Bashan became understood as the bed of a giant. That is not debunking the Bible. It is reading it carefully, and it is the kind of careful reading that honest interpretation requires. But let us also be fair to the other side and hold the genuine open question. The text does say bed, and it does say iron, and it does give the measurement by the cubit of a man. And a reader is entitled to take those words at their plain meaning. The sober interpretation is a reconstruction, a reasonable and well-argued one, but a reconstruction nonetheless. What is certain is only this. The text records an enormous object associated with Og, offered as evidence of his size, and it invites the reader to go and see it. Whether that object was a literal iron bed proving a 13-foot king, or a great basalt sarcophagus that became legendary, the text itself does not finally settle, and honest readers can weigh the possibilities. And there is one more thing worth noticing about the verse, which is its rhetorical purpose within the story. Why does the narrator pause to mention the bed at all? Because it functions as proof. as a tangible anchor for an extraordinary claim. The text has just called Og the last of the Rephaim, the last of the giants. That is a large claim, and the bed is offered to substantiate it, to give the reader something concrete, something that could still be seen, a physical relic vouching for the reality of the giant king. The bed serves the narrative. It makes the giant credible by pointing to an object that outlived him. And that rhetorical function is worth keeping in mind because it reminds us that the detail is doing work in the story, anchoring a claim about a vanished race in a monument the audience could supposedly go and view for themselves. So the bed of Og teaches us the method for everything that follows. Here is a real detail in a real text, pointing to what may well have been a real object, and around it, the interpretation of it as the literal bed of a 13-foot giant may be legend growing on a kernel of fact, a genuine ancient monument transformed in the telling into proof of a giant. The relic is solid. The giant it supposedly measures is where the wonder and the uncertainty begin. Hold that lesson close, because as we go deeper, the ratio of legend to fact will only grow. We have met the king and considered his bed. Now it is time to widen our view from Og himself to the race he belonged to, because the text does not present Og as a lone giant, a single freak of size. It presents him as the last of a people, the final survivor of an entire race of giants, the Rephaim, who once inhabited the land and who stood alongside other clans of giants with strange and ancient names. To understand Og, we have to understand the world of giants he came from. Let us enter the land of the Rephaim. Og was not a solitary giant. This is one of the most important things to understand about him, and it is easy to miss if you think of giants as lone monsters, isolated freaks of nature towering over an otherwise ordinary world. The text does not present Og that way. It presents him as the last of a people, a race, an entire population of giants with a name, a history, a territory, and a place in the ancient order of the world. That race was the Rephaim. And to understand Og, we have to understand them, because he was their final king, the last ember of a fire that had once burned across the land. The Rephaim appear throughout the Hebrew Bible as an ancient race associated with great size and great antiquity. They are presented as one of the peoples who inhabited the land in the deep past before Israel, a race remembered as giants, powerful and formidable, dwelling in the land east of the Jordan and in other regions, and gradually passing out of history, displaced and diminished, until only remnants remained. By the time of Og, the Rephaim were already a fading people, a race in its twilight, and Og was described as the last of them, the final survivor of a race that had once been widespread and was now nearly gone. The very name carries a strange and haunting double meaning that has fascinated scholars. In the Hebrew Bible, the word rendered as Rephaim is used in two connected but distinct ways. In some passages, it refers to this ancient race of giants, the living people of great size. But in other passages, the same word, Rephaim, refers to the dead, to the shades or spirits of the departed in the underworld, the ghostly inhabitants of the realm of the dead. The same word means both the giants and the dead, and this doubling is deeply evocative. The Rephaim are both a race of ancient giants and, in another register, the shadowy dead of the underworld, as if the giants and the departed spirits of the old world were somehow bound together in the language itself, a vanished race, and the realm of the vanished sharing a single name. Whether this reflects a genuine ancient connection between the giants and the cult of the dead, or a linguistic overlap that later took on meaning, it lends the Rephaim an aura of the uncanny, a people associated at once with towering life and with the shadows beyond death. And the land of Bashan, Og's kingdom, was particularly associated with the Rephaim, steeped in their memory. Bashan was, in a sense, the last stronghold of the giants, the region where the ancient race lingered longest, where their final king still reigned. The text connects Bashan explicitly to the Rephaim, marking it as a land haunted by the old giants, their ancestral territory, the place where the last of them held out. There is even a phrase in some readings of the tradition that ties Bashan to the Rephaim in its very identity, as if the land itself were the land of the giants, the country of the Rephaim, their remembered homeland. When Og ruled in Bashan, he ruled in the heartland of his vanishing race, the last king in the last kingdom of the giants. But the Rephaim were not the only giants the text describes, and this is what makes the biblical picture so striking. It does not present a single race of giants, but several, a whole world of giant clans, with different names, inhabiting different regions, remembered by different peoples. When you gather them together, you begin to see that the tradition imagined the ancient world as populated in its deep past by multiple races of giants, of which the Rephaim were one. Let us meet the others, because they fill out the world Og came from. There were the Anakim, perhaps the most famous of the giant clans after the Rephaim, the descendants of a figure named Anak. The Anakim were remembered as giants of terrifying size, dwelling in the land of Canaan, in the hill country, and in cities of the Promised Land, and they play a pivotal role in the story of Israel, because when Moses sent spies into the land to scout it before the conquest, it was the Anakim the spies saw, and it was the Anakim who filled them with terror. The spies came back with a report that would become infamous, describing a land whose inhabitants were of great size, and describing themselves by comparison as feeling like grasshoppers, tiny and helpless before the towering giants of Canaan. The Anakim were the giants who frightened Israel away from the land for a generation, the giants whose presence turned the people back in fear. And they were connected, in the tradition, to the same ancient stock as the Rephaim, another branch of the great and terrible race of giants that haunted the land. There were the Emim, another ancient race of giants, remembered as former inhabitants of a region east of the Jordan, before other peoples displaced them. The text explicitly connects the Emim to the Rephaim, describing them as a people great and numerous and tall, counted among the Rephaim, or reckoned as Rephaim, another clan of the ancient giants who had once held the land and then passed away, displaced by later peoples. The Emim are a reminder that the giants were, in the tradition's memory, spread across multiple regions, multiple peoples, each remembering the giants who had come before. And there were the Zamzumim, a name strange and evocative, yet another race of ancient giants, remembered as former inhabitants of another region, also connected to the Rephaim, also described as a people great and numerous and tall who had dwelt in the land before being displaced. Like the Emim, the Zamzumim are counted among the Rephaim, another clan of the vanished giants, another people remembered only as the towering predecessors who had once held a land now inhabited by others. Step back and look at the pattern that emerges, because it is remarkable. The tradition remembers not one race of giants, but a whole family of them, spread across the ancient world, each associated with a region, each remembered by the peoples who came after. The Rephaim in Bashan and beyond, the Anakim in Canaan, the Emim and the Zamzumim in other lands east of the Jordan, and they are connected, woven together, many of them explicitly reckoned as branches or kindred of the Rephaim, a single great category of ancient giants divided into clans and peoples. The deep past in this vision was a world in which giants were widespread, inhabiting land after land, region after region, a whole order of towering beings who had once held the earth and were, by the time of Moses passing away, displaced and dwindling, remembered with awe and fear. And this is the world Og came from. He was not an anomaly, a single inexplicable giant. He was the last king of one clan of a widespread race, the final survivor of the Rephaim, standing at the end of a long twilight in which the giants had been fading from the world for ages. When the text calls him the last of the Rephaim, it places him at the very end of this grand and terrible lineage, the last crowned head of a race that had once ruled land after land and was now reduced to a single aging king in a single kingdom. His fall would be the end of an era that reached back into the deepest past. Now, honesty requires us to pause and ask what to make of all this, and here we must hold several things at once. On one level, this is a rich and coherent picture within the tradition, a remembered world of giant races described consistently across the text, integral to the story of Israel's origins and conquest. On another level, we must ask what lies behind it. Were there truly races of giants inhabiting the ancient Near East? The sober and honest answer is that there is no archaeological evidence for actual populations of people 9 or 10 or 13 feet tall. No giant skeletons, no remains of towering races, and everything we know about human biology makes literal races of such giants extremely implausible. Human height has real limits imposed by the very structure of our bodies, and populations of 10-foot people are not something the physical record supports. So what were the Rephaim and the Anakim and the rest? There are several honest possibilities, and they are not mutually exclusive. Some scholars suggest that behind these traditions lie real peoples, perhaps unusually tall or powerful populations, or peoples associated with impressive megalithic ruins, great ancient stone structures that later generations, awed by their scale, attributed to a vanished race of giants. The lands east of the Jordan do contain ancient megalithic monuments, massive stone structures and dolmens whose builders were forgotten, and it is easy to imagine how such imposing ruins could give rise to legends of the giants who must have built them. Others suggest that the giant clans reflect the ordinary human tendency to remember earlier inhabitants, especially formidable enemies, as larger and more terrible than they were, magnifying the peoples who came before into races of giants. And still others see in the Rephaim, with their eerie double meaning of giants and dead, a connection to ancient beliefs about the mighty dead, the heroic ancestors of a former age, remembered as a race of the great departed. The most honest position holds these possibilities open. The giant races of the tradition are almost certainly not literal populations of 10-foot people, for which there is no evidence and against which there is much. But they are also not simply nothing. They likely reflect some combination of real memory and magnification, of impressive ruins and formidable predecessors, and ancient beliefs about the mighty dead, woven into a vivid tradition of vanished giant races. The Rephaim, in this reading, are real as a tradition, real as a memory of something, even if that something was not literally a race of giants of the size the legends came to claim. But whatever lies behind them, within the world of the tradition, the Rephaim were real, and Og was their last king. And now we come to the part of his story that transforms him from a remarkable king into a truly impossible one. because the text places Og at the end of the Rephaim in the time of Moses. But the tradition would come to claim that Og's origins reached back much, much further, all the way back before the Great Flood. And that claim creates a problem, a genuine impossibility that the tradition would have to solve with one of the most extraordinary legends ever told. How could a giant of the ancient race still be alive after the flood that was meant to destroy all such beings? To answer that, the tradition told the story of how Og clung to the ark. Let us cross now from the text into the legend and follow the giant onto the roof of the ark through the drowning of the world. We now cross a threshold, and I want to mark it clearly because it is the most important boundary in this entire documentary. Everything we have discussed so far, the king, the bed, the Rephaim, comes from the biblical text itself. It is the first layer, the scripture as it stands. But the story we are about to enter, the most famous and most extraordinary story about Og, the one that makes him unforgettable, is not in the Bible at all. You will not find it in Deuteronomy or Numbers or Joshua. It comes from the second layer, from later Jewish tradition, from the rabbinic writings, the Talmud and the Midrash, composed centuries after the biblical text. We are crossing from scripture into legend, and the legend is a marvel. The legend answers a question the biblical text raises but never resolves, a question we will explore fully in the next part of our journey. But for now, simply feel the shape of it. Og was the last of the Rephaim, an ancient race of giants. And in the deeper tradition, that race of giants was connected to the age before the flood, to the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, the giants who filled the earth in the days before the deluge. But the flood destroyed that world. The flood was sent, in part, precisely to wipe out that corrupted race of giants, to drown them and cleanse the earth. So how could Og, a giant of that ancient stock, still be alive generations later, in the time of Moses? If the flood destroyed the giants, how did this giant survive? The rabbinic legend answers with a story of stunning audacity. Og, it says, survived the flood. He was there before the deluge, one of the giants of the old world. And when the waters came, when the rain fell and the deep burst forth and the world began to drown, Og did not perish with the rest of the giants. He escaped. And the way he escaped is the unforgettable heart of the legend. He clung to the ark. Picture it as the legend paints it, the great ark of Noah, the wooden vessel built to preserve the righteous remnant, and the animals through the drowning of the world, floating on the rising waters as the earth vanished beneath the flood. And clinging to the outside of it, riding on the roof or holding fast to the side or perched upon it, is a giant. Og, the enormous survivor of the old world, too large to be inside, hanging on to the exterior of the ark as it rode out the deluge, carried above the drowned earth by the very vessel meant to save humanity from the giants and the corruption of his age. Every other giant on earth drowned. Og alone survived, clinging to the ark, floating over the grave of his entire race. And the legend adds details that make it stranger and, in a way, more intimate. In some versions, Og makes a bargain or a plea, and Noah agrees to keep him alive. Noah, inside the ark, feeds the giant clinging to the outside, passing him food through an opening, sustaining the last giant through the long months of the flood. The image is extraordinary, almost tender in its strangeness. The righteous Noah, the man chosen to survive the destruction of the giants, keeping one giant alive, feeding him through a hole in the ark as the waters cover the world. In some tellings, Og swears to become a servant to Noah and his descendants in exchange for his life, binding himself to the survivors in return for his rescue. The giant and the ark, the monster and the righteous man, bound together through the drowning of the world. Why would Noah do this? Why would the legend have the righteous survivor preserve the very kind of being the flood was meant to destroy? The traditions offer various reasons, and they are revealing. In some versions, it is simple mercy or a bargain struck. In others, there is a sense of destiny, that Og was preserved for a purpose, that he had a role yet to play in the story to come, which of course he did, as the giant King Moses would one day face. The legend seems to sense that Og needed to survive, that his survival was required by the larger story, and it finds a way, however improbable, to carry him across the great divide of the flood, from the world before to the world after. Now let us be clear and honest about what this is, because the clarity is essential. This story, the story of Og clinging to the ark, is legend. It is rabbinic tradition, imaginative interpretation, composed long after the biblical text, elaborating on the terse scriptural mentions of Og and weaving them into the larger tapestry of the tradition. It is not history, it is not in the Bible. No text contemporary with the events, no scripture records Og riding out the flood on the ark. This is the creative, interpretive storytelling tradition of later Judaism, filling in gaps, resolving tensions, and spinning the bare bones of the biblical Og into a rich and vivid legend. When we tell the story of Og and the ark, we are telling a legend, and we should never mistake it for the biblical account, which contains nothing of the kind. But here is why the legend is so much more than a mere tall tale, and why it rewards serious attention rather than dismissal. The legend is not arbitrary. It is not a random flight of fancy. It is a solution. It is the tradition's answer to a genuine problem embedded in its own scriptures, a contradiction the careful readers of the tradition noticed and felt compelled to resolve. And understanding that problem is the key to understanding not just this legend, but the entire mystery of Og, and indeed the entire mystery of the giants after the flood. The legend of Og clinging to the ark exists because the tradition faced an impossible situation, a giant who should not have been able to exist and had to explain how he did. Think about what the rabbis were doing. They were not simply making up a fun story. They were close, careful, reverent readers of their own scriptures, and they noticed things. They noticed that the text called Og the last of the Rephaim, an ancient race of giants. They connected the giants to the age before the flood, to the Nephilim of Genesis. They knew the flood was meant to destroy that corrupted world, and they noticed that nevertheless, giants appeared after the flood, in the time of Moses and beyond. That was a problem. That was a genuine tension in the sacred text, a contradiction that demanded resolution. And the legend of Og and the ark is the resolution, a bridge built to carry the giant across the impossible gap, an explanation for how the ancient race of giants could have survived the very catastrophe meant to end it. So the legend, however fantastical, is doing serious interpretive work. It is the tradition grappling honestly with its own contradictions and finding a creative solution. And that makes it far more interesting than a simple fairy tale. It is a window into how traditions think, how they resolve tensions, how they preserve coherence in the face of apparent contradiction. The image of the giant clinging to the ark is not just striking. It is a piece of theological problem-solving, dressed in the vivid garments of legend. And there is something else worth noticing about the legend, a deeper resonance. The story of Og surviving the flood makes him something extraordinary within the tradition, a survivor of the old world, a living relic of the age before the deluge. carried into the new world as a remnant of the old. He becomes a kind of bridge between the two worlds, the antediluvian and the post-diluvian, the world before the flood and the world after. He is the last living link to the age of the Nephilim, the age of the great giants, the corrupted world that God drowned. Everyone else from that world perished. Og alone, in the legend, carried the memory and the bloodline of the old world into the new, until the day Moses finally ended him. He is the last survivor of a drowned world, and his death is the final end of the age before the flood, delayed by generations, but inevitable at last. That is the power of the legend, and it is why it has endured. It transforms Og from a regional giant king into a figure of cosmic significance, the last survivor of the antediluvian world, the final giant of the old order, clinging to life across the great catastrophe until the story is ready to let him die. It is legend, not history, but it is legend of a high and serious kind, born from a real problem in the text and reaching toward a real meaning. To understand that problem fully and to see why the tradition was so compelled to keep Og alive, we have to turn now to the deep contradiction at the heart of the whole tradition of the giants. The flood was meant to end them, and yet they persisted. Let us examine the problem that Og was, in a sense, invented to solve, the impossible survival of the giants after the flood. We have arrived at the intellectual heart of this entire subject. Everything we have explored so far, the king, the bed, the Rephaim, the legend of the ark, converges here on a single problem, a genuine contradiction buried in the tradition's own sacred text. And once you see this problem clearly, the whole mystery of Og, and indeed the whole mystery of the giants, suddenly makes a new kind of sense, because Og, in a way we are about to unravel, is the answer to a question the tradition could not otherwise resolve. To understand him, we have to understand the problem he solves. Let us build the problem carefully, piece by piece, exactly as the careful readers of the tradition would have encountered it. It begins in the book of Genesis, in one of the most mysterious and haunting passages in all of Scripture. Before the flood, the text tells us, something strange happened on the earth. The sons of God, whatever exactly that phrase means, and it has been debated for millennia, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives, and from these unions came offspring. And the text says that there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These offspring, or the beings of that age, are called the Nephilim, a term of uncertain meaning often associated with the giants, the mighty ones, the fallen, the heroes of old, the men of renown. In the days before the flood, the earth was filled with these beings, the Nephilim, giants born of the union of the divine and the human, a corrupted and mighty race. And this, in the deeper tradition, is intimately connected to why the flood came. The passage about the Nephilim sits immediately before the account of the flood, and in the logic of the narrative, and even more in the interpretive tradition, the two are linked. The earth had become corrupted, filled with violence and wickedness, and the presence of the Nephilim, the giants, the offspring of the forbidden union, was bound up with that corruption. The flood was God's response, a great cleansing, a drowning of the corrupted world to wipe it clean and begin again with Noah, the one righteous man, and his family. And in the fuller tradition, especially in the elaborated versions found in texts like the Book of Enoch, the destruction of the giants is a central purpose of the flood. The giants, the Nephilim, the monstrous offspring, were to be destroyed, drowned, erased from the earth. The flood was, among other things, the end of the age of giants, the extermination of the Nephilim and their kind. So here is the first half of the problem established firmly. The Nephilim, the giants, belonged to the world before the flood, and the flood was meant to destroy them, to end them, to wipe that corrupted race from the earth. After the flood, the giants should have been gone. That is the clear logic of the tradition. The deluge cleansed the world of the giants. But now comes the second half of the problem, and it is a genuine and jarring contradiction. Because the giants do not stay gone, they reappear. After the flood, generations later, in the time of Moses and the conquest of the promised land, the text is full of giants. We have already met them. The Rephaim, of whom Og was the last king, the Anakim who terrified the spies, the Emim, the Zamzumim, giant races inhabiting the land, formidable and tall, exactly the kind of beings the flood was supposed to have destroyed. And there is a verse that makes the contradiction almost explicit, that seems to reach back and connect the post-diluvian giants directly to the antediluvian ones. When the spies returned from scouting the land of Canaan, they report seeing giants, and the text says they saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. The Nephilim, the same word, the same term used for the giants before the flood, applied now to the giants the spies see in the land after the flood. The text itself seems to identify the giants of Canaan with the Nephilim of the old world. Do you see the problem now in its full force? The Nephilim were destroyed by the flood, and yet the Nephilim or their descendants are present after the flood in the promised land, standing in Israel's path. How? If the flood wiped out the giants, where did these giants come from? If the Nephilim perished in the deluge, why does the text say the giants of Canaan come from the Nephilim? The tradition's own scriptures seem to contradict themselves. The giants were destroyed, and the giants survived. Both cannot be true, and yet both are in the text. This is not a modern invention, not a skeptic's gotcha. This is a genuine tension that the careful, reverent readers of the tradition noticed themselves centuries ago and felt compelled to resolve. They were committed to the coherence of their scriptures. They could not simply accept a flat contradiction, so they had to find an explanation. How did the giants, the Nephilim bloodline, survive the flood that was meant to destroy them? And this, at last, is where Og comes in, and where his strange legend reveals its true purpose. Because there are, broadly, two ways the tradition could resolve the problem, and both were explored. The first way is to propose that the giants reappeared after the flood through some new occurrence, that the same kind of union or corruption happened again after the deluge, producing new giants in the new world. This is one line of tradition, that the phenomenon that produced the Nephilim was not entirely one time, that giants could arise again. But this is theologically awkward, because it suggests the flood did not fully accomplish its purpose, that the corruption returned. The second way, and the one that gives us the legend of Og, is more elegant and more audacious. It proposes that the giants survived the flood because at least one of them was not destroyed, that the bloodline was carried across the deluge by a survivor, a single giant who lived through the flood and preserved the ancient line into the new world. And who was that survivor? Og, clinging to the ark. Og, the last of the Rephaim, the giant who rode out the deluge on the roof of Noah's vessel, carrying the ancient bloodline of the Nephilim across the great catastrophe into the world after the flood. Now you see why the legend exists. It is not a random tale. It is the solution to the problem. The tradition needed a way for the giant bloodline to survive the flood. because the giants were undeniably present after the flood, and yet the flood was supposed to have destroyed them. Og is the bridge. Og is the mechanism. Og is how the tradition explains the survival of the giants. By having one giant cling to the ark and live, the tradition preserves the coherence of its story. The flood destroyed the giants, yes, all of them, except one, and that one carried the line forward, which is why giants still walk the earth in the time of Moses. Og solves the problem. Og is the answer to the impossible question. And this is a genuinely brilliant piece of interpretive work, whatever you make of it as history. The tradition faced a real contradiction in its sacred text, and it resolved it with a story that is at once fantastical and logically elegant. The giants had to survive the flood because they were there afterward. So one giant survived the flood, clinging to the ark, and became the source of the giants who came after. And that giant was Og, the last of the Rephaim, the last survivor of the old world, whom Moses would finally kill, ending at last the bloodline that the flood had failed to fully erase. The death of Og becomes the true final end of the Nephilim, the completion of what the flood began, the last drop of the ancient bloodline extinguished at last. Let us step back and appreciate what we have uncovered, because it transforms how we understand Og entirely. Og is not merely a giant king, he is a solution to a theological problem. He is the tradition's way of reconciling the destruction of the giants in the flood with the presence of the giants afterward. His impossible survival, his clinging to the ark, is not a decorative legend, but a load-bearing one, a story that holds up the coherence of the entire tradition of the giants. Without Og, or something like him, the tradition has a contradiction it cannot resolve. With Og, the story hangs together. The last of the Rephaim is the keystone that holds the arch of the whole giant tradition in place. And this reveals something profound about how traditions work, about how they grow and elaborate and resolve their own tensions over time. The bare biblical Og, the king of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim, was expanded by later tradition into the survivor of the flood precisely because the larger story needed him to be. The legend grew to fill a logical gap, to answer a question the text raised but did not answer, and in doing so, it turned a regional giant king into a cosmic figure, a survivor of the drowned world, the last link to the age of the Nephilim. This is the tradition thinking, reasoning, problem-solving in the language of legend and story rather than argument, but doing real intellectual work all the same. So when we ask what Og's existence means for the Nephilim bloodline, we now have a deep and genuine answer at the level of the tradition. Og is the Nephilim bloodline's survival. He is the reason the giants persisted after the flood, the carrier of the ancient line, the bridge from the antediluvian giants to the giants of the promised land. His existence means that the age of giants did not end with the flood as it was supposed to, but was prolonged, carried forward by a single survivor until it could be ended properly in battle by Moses and Israel. The whole arc of the giants, from the Nephilim before the flood to Goliath long after, runs through Og, the survivor who kept the line alive. But of course, all of this is the internal logic of the tradition, the way the legend resolves its own problem. It is not history, and we will weigh the historical questions honestly when we reach them. For now, we have understood the deepest meaning of Og within the tradition, and it is time to return to his story and to its end, because the survivor of the flood, the last of the Rephaim, the keystone of the giant tradition, did finally meet his end. The prolonged age of giants did finally close, and it closed in battle on a specific day in a specific place when the last giant king came out to fight Moses and Israel, and fell. Let us go to the war at Edrei and witness the fall of the last giant king. Every giant story, in the end, comes to a battle. The giant rises, towering and terrible, and then, at last, he falls. Goliath had his valley and his shepherd boy, and Og, the greater giant, the older king, the survivor of the flood, had his own final battlefield. It was a place called Edrei, one of his royal cities, in the land of Bashan. And it was there, according to the tradition, that the last of the Rephaim, the last giant king, came out to meet Moses and the people of Israel and met his end. Let us return now to the biblical text, to the account of the war, and witness the fall of the last giant king. To understand the battle, we have to understand the moment in Israel's journey when it came. The people, led by Moses, were in the final stage of their long wandering, approaching the promised land from the east, moving through the territories east of the Jordan River. They had been traveling for a generation, and they were now clearing the path toward the land they had been promised, encountering and defeating the kingdoms that stood in their way. Just before Og, they had faced Sihon, king of the Amorites, who came out against them and was defeated, his kingdom taken. And now, having defeated Sihon, they turned and went up the road toward Bashan, and there, waiting, was Og. The text describes the encounter with striking economy. Og, king of Bashan, came out against them, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. The last giant king did not wait behind his walls. He came out with his whole army to meet Israel in open battle at his city of Edrei. Picture the scene, the two forces arrayed against each other, and at the head of one of them, the towering figure of Og, the last of the Rephaim, the giant whose bed was 13 feet long, the survivor of the drowned world, leading his people into battle against the advancing Israelites. It is the confrontation the whole story has been building toward, the last giant king facing the people who would end his kind. And here the text records that detail we noted earlier, the detail that reveals how fearsome Og truly was. Before the battle, God speaks to Moses, and the words are these: "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hand and all his people and his land. Do not fear him." Once again, the tradition marks Og as an object of special dread, a king so formidable that the people needed to be told directly by God not to be afraid. This is not said of every enemy. It is said of Og because Og was terrifying, a giant king, the last of an ancient and dreadful race, and the fear he inspired was real and had to be answered. The divine reassurance is itself a testimony to Og's greatness, to the terror of facing the last of the Rephaim in battle. Why would Israel fear Og so greatly? Everything we have explored gives the answer. He was a giant of enormous size, a being out of the terrible ancient past. He was the last of the Rephaim, the final king of the giant race. He was, in the legend, the survivor of the flood himself, a relic of the antediluvian world, older than any ordinary man could comprehend. To face Og was to face the accumulated dread of the entire tradition of the giants, the last and perhaps the greatest of them standing at the head of his army. Of course, the people were afraid. Of course, they needed to be told not to fear. Og was the embodiment of the ancient terror of the giants, and here he was, in the flesh, blocking their path. But the reassurance came with a promise. I have delivered him into your hand. The outcome was already decided in the telling. Og would fall. The last giant king, for all his size and all his terror, was destined to be defeated, his people and his land given over to Israel. And so it happened. The text records the outcome with the same economy. They defeated him and his sons and all his people until there was no survivor left to him, and they took possession of his land. The giant king fell, his army was destroyed, his sons, his heirs, the continuation of his line were killed. His kingdom was conquered and taken. Og, the last of the Rephaim, was utterly defeated, and his people were left without a survivor. Sit with that phrase for a moment, until there was no survivor left to him. The last of the Rephaim, and after the battle, no survivor. This is the extinction of a race described in a single line. Og was the last king of the giants, and with his fall and the fall of his sons and his people, the Rephaim were finished. The line that had survived the flood, the bloodline carried across the deluge, according to the legend, on the roof of the ark, ended here at Edrei in a single battle. The giant who had outlived the drowning of the world finally met the end he had escaped for so long. The prolonged age of giants, extended by his impossible survival, closed at last on this battlefield, and the tradition remembered this victory as a great one, a defining moment in the story of Israel's journey to the Promised Land. Og's defeat is recounted not once but repeatedly across the scriptures, a sign of how significant it was in the memory of the people. It appears in the book of Numbers, in the account of the journey. It is retold in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses recalls the victory and where the bed is described, offered as a memorial of the fallen giant. It appears in the book of Joshua, where the conquered land of Og, the kingdom of Bashan, is divided among the tribes of Israel as their inheritance, the giant's realm parceled out to the people who had defeated him. And Og is remembered in the Psalms, in the songs of Israel, celebrated in worship as one of the mighty kings whom God struck down, his defeat sung as a mark of divine deliverance, remembered generation after generation in the praises of the people. The recurrence of Og's defeat across so many books tells us how the tradition understood it. This was not a minor skirmish. It was the fall of the last giant king, the conquest of the land of the Rephaim, the end of an ancient and terrible race. It was remembered, retold, celebrated, and sung, woven into the identity of Israel as one of the great victories on the road to the Promised Land. The overthrow of the last of the giants who had haunted the land since the deepest past. Now, honesty requires us to step back once more and acknowledge the layers as we have throughout. The battle at Edrei, the defeat of Og, is part of the biblical text, the first layer, the scripture as it stands. Whether it reflects a real historical event, a real king defeated in a real battle, is a question we cannot answer with certainty. The conquest narratives of this period are the subject of much scholarly discussion, and the historical reality behind them is genuinely uncertain and debated. What we can say is that within the tradition, the fall of Og was remembered as a real and significant victory, the end of the last giant king, and it was recorded and celebrated as such across the scriptures. The giant Og, whatever his historical reality, was remembered as having fallen at Edrei, his race extinguished, his kingdom taken. And within the world of the tradition, the meaning of that fall is profound. The last of the Rephaim was dead. The survivor of the flood was dead. The bloodline carried across the deluge was extinguished. The age of giants, prolonged by Og's impossible survival, had finally, truly ended. What the flood began and failed to complete, the sword of Israel finished at Edrei. The last drop of the ancient giant bloodline was spilled, and the world was, at last, free of the Rephaim. The giant who outlived his world outlived it no longer. But the story of the giants does not quite end with Og, and this is where we must widen our view once more. From the last king of the Rephaim to the whole sweep of the giant bloodline, and to the modern speculation that has grown around it. Because Og was the last of the Rephaim, But he was not quite the last giant in the tradition. There would be others later, remnants and stragglers, culminating in the most famous giant of all, Goliath. And the connection between Og and the Nephilim and Goliath and all the scattered giants of the tradition has given rise in the modern imagination to a grand theory, the theory of a surviving bloodline of giants, a lineage of the Nephilim threaded through history. Let us follow that bloodline now, from the Nephilim before the flood to the giants of the promised land and beyond, and see where the tradition ends and modern speculation begins. We have followed Og from his kingdom to his bed to his fall. But his story opens onto something larger, a thread that runs through the entire tradition, connecting the giants of the deepest past to the giants of later ages, and giving rise in the modern imagination to one of the most compelling ideas in all of this subject, the idea of a bloodline. A lineage of giants, the Nephilim bloodline, running like a dark river through history from before the flood to long after, of which Og was one crucial link. Let us trace that bloodline carefully through its 3 layers, from the text to the tradition to the modern speculation, and see what it really is. Begin with what the tradition itself connects, because the connections are genuinely there, woven through the text. We start before the flood with the Nephilim, the giants born of the union of the sons of God and the daughters of men, the mighty ones of the ancient world. That is the source, the origin of the giants in the tradition, the fountainhead of the bloodline. From there, the flood intervenes, meant to destroy the giants, and as we have seen, the tradition bridges the flood with the survival of Og, carrying the bloodline across the deluge into the world after. And on the far side of the flood, we find the giant races of the promised land, the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, and the text itself, as we noted, connects the Anakim of Canaan to the Nephilim, saying the giants the spies saw came from the Nephilim. So the tradition draws a line, however faint and broken, from the Nephilim before the flood through the survival across the deluge to the giant races that Israel encountered. The bloodline within the tradition is a real thread, and it continues past Og to the most famous giant of all. Because after the conquest, after the fall of the Rephaim, the tradition still records giants, remnants, scattered survivors of the giant races, lingering on in pockets of the land. And the greatest of these late remnants, the last famous giant of the tradition, was Goliath. Goliath of Gath, the Philistine champion, the towering warrior felled by David. And Goliath is connected in the tradition to these lingering remnants of the giant races, one of the last of the giants, a straggler from the ancient stock, appearing generations after Og in the time of David. There are even other giants mentioned around Goliath, other large warriors of Gath, described as descendants of the giants, remnants of the old race, a handful of the last giants persisting in the Philistine lands. Goliath and his kindred are the final flicker of the giant bloodline in the tradition, the last of the last. So within the tradition, we can trace a bloodline of giants that runs from the Nephilim before the flood, across the deluge through Og's survival, to the Rephaim and Anakim of the Promised Land, and on to the last remnants culminating in Goliath. That is a genuine thread, connecting the giants of the tradition into a single lineage, a bloodline of the mighty ones running through the whole story, from the corrupted world before the flood to the valley where David faced Goliath. And Og sits at a crucial point in that lineage, the survivor who carried the bloodline across the flood, the link between the antediluvian giants and all who came after. This is the meaning of Og for the Nephilim bloodline at the level of the tradition. He is the bridge, the carrier, the one who kept the line alive across the great catastrophe, Now let us cross into the third layer, the modern speculation, because this genuine traditional thread has been taken up and enormously expanded in the modern imagination into a grand theory that goes far beyond anything the text or the old traditions actually claim. And here, as always, we must be clear about where we are standing, presenting the theory in its full force, and then examining it honestly. The modern theory of the Nephilim bloodline takes the traditional thread and makes of it something vast and systematic. In its fuller forms, it proposes that the Nephilim bloodline did not end with Goliath, that the lineage of the giants, the descendants of the fallen angels and their offspring, has persisted throughout history, hidden, threaded through the generations, surviving in secret down to the present day. It connects the Nephilim to giants and mighty figures across many cultures and ages. It sometimes proposes that the bloodline carries special qualities, powers, or purposes, that the descendants of the Nephilim are a distinct lineage moving through history with their own destiny. It weaves the giants of the Bible into a much larger tapestry, a hidden history of a superhuman or non-human bloodline shaping the world from the shadows. In its most elaborate forms, it becomes a grand theory of secret history, the Nephilim bloodline as a persistent, hidden lineage, still present, still active, a race apart, moving through the human story. Feel the appeal of this, because it is powerful. It takes the scattered giants of the tradition and unifies them into a single, continuous, hidden lineage, a secret bloodline running through all of history, giving the fragmentary giant stories a grand and sinister coherence. It suggests that the giants were not just isolated legends, but chapters in a single ongoing story, a bloodline that never truly ended, that persists, hidden to this day. It is the giant tradition transformed into a vast conspiracy of secret history, and for those drawn to hidden patterns and secret lineages, it is irresistible. And now honestly, we must examine it. And here we must distinguish carefully between the layers, because the modern theory blends them in a way that obscures what is actually supported and what is not. The traditional thread, the connection of the giants within the biblical and rabbinic tradition, is real as a tradition. The text does connect the Anakim to the Nephilim. The tradition does bridge the flood with Og's survival. Goliath is connected to the remnants of the giant races. This is genuine, a real feature of the tradition, and it is fascinating. But notice what it is. It is a literary and theological thread, a way the tradition connects its own stories, not a documented genetic lineage of actual superhuman beings. It tells us how the tradition thought about the giants, how it wove them together, not that there was, in historical fact, a bloodline of 10-foot beings descending through the generations. And the modern extension, the persistent hidden bloodline surviving to the present day, threaded through all of history, is speculation that goes far beyond both the text and the tradition, and for which there is no evidence. There is no genetic evidence of a lineage of giant superhuman beings. There is no documented bloodline of Nephilim descendants. There are no remains of the persistent giants the theory requires. The modern Nephilim bloodline theory takes the genuine literary thread of the tradition and inflates it into a claim about real, hidden, persistent history, a claim that the evidence does not support and that belongs to the realm of imaginative speculation rather than established fact. It is the tradition's thread spun out into a conspiracy of secret history, unmoored from the evidence. So what is the honest verdict on the bloodline of the Nephilim? It is this. Within the tradition, there is a genuine and fascinating thread connecting the giants from the Nephilim before the flood, across the deluge through Og, to the Rephaim and Anakim, and finally to Goliath, a literary and theological lineage that the text and the later tradition really do weave together. Og really is, within that tradition, a crucial link in the chain, the survivor who carried the line across the flood. That much is real, as a feature of the tradition. But the modern theory of a persistent, hidden historical bloodline of superhuman Nephilim descendants surviving through the ages to the present goes far beyond the tradition and the evidence into unsupported speculation. The thread is real as literature and theology. The secret bloodline of history is a modern dream built upon it. And there is something worth reflecting on here about why the bloodline theory is so compelling despite its lack of evidence. It answers a deep human desire, the desire to find hidden connections, secret lineages, a coherent pattern behind the scattered fragments of the past. The giants of the tradition are fragmentary, appearing here and there in different ages with different names. The bloodline theory gathers them into a single story, gives them continuity, meaning a hidden thread that connects them all. It is the same impulse we find throughout this whole genre, the longing to connect the scattered into the whole, to find the secret pattern, the hidden lineage, the single thread that explains everything. And like all such theories, it is powerful precisely because it satisfies that longing, whether or not the evidence supports it. Og then means something real for the tradition of the giants, and something quite different for the modern bloodline theory. For the tradition, he is the genuine link, the survivor who carried the giant line across the flood, a crucial figure in the internal logic of the scriptures and the legends. For the modern theory, he is enlisted as evidence of a hidden bloodline that persists through history, a role that goes far beyond what he actually was, even within the tradition. The honest reader can appreciate the genuine thread while remaining clear-eyed about the speculative extension. But there is one more dimension to the giants we have not yet fully explored, and it is the widest of all, because giants are not only a feature of this one tradition. Stories of giants appear across the cultures of the whole world, in land after land, tradition after tradition. And that worldwide recurrence raises its own questions and invites its own honest examination. Why do humans everywhere tell of giants? What lies behind the universal memory of the great ancient beings? Let us widen our view to the giants of the whole world and weigh them as honestly as we can. We have followed Og and the giants of one tradition, the biblical and rabbinic world of the Nephilim and the Rephaim. But if we lift our eyes from that single tradition and look across the whole world, we find something that deepens the mystery and demands its own explanation. Giants are everywhere. Not just in the Bible, not just in the ancient Near East, but in the myths and legends of cultures across the entire globe. The memory of giants, of a race of great beings who came before, who were larger and mightier than ordinary humans, appears again and again in land after land, among peoples who never shared their stories. And that worldwide recurrence is a phenomenon we must confront honestly, both for what it might suggest and for what it actually means. Consider the sheer reach of it. In the myths of ancient Greece, there were giants, the gigantes, and before the gods themselves, there were the titans, a race of primordial giant beings who ruled in the earliest age before being overthrown. There were giants in the traditions of the Norse, the frost giants and mountain giants, ancient enemies of the gods, present from the beginning of the world. There are giants in the folklore of the British Isles, in the legends of many European peoples, great beings who once inhabited the land, who built great structures, who were displaced by later inhabitants. There are traditions of giants, of ancient races of great beings in cultures across the Americas, in the oral traditions of many indigenous peoples. There are giant traditions in Asia, in Africa, across the Pacific. Nearly everywhere you look, in the mythologies and folklores of the world, you find giants, a race of great beings who came before, remembered with awe and often with fear. And the pattern is remarkably consistent. Again and again, the giants are ancient, belonging to an earlier age, a former world. Again and again, they are associated with the deep past, with the time before the current order, with the primordial world. Again and again, they are larger and mightier than ordinary humans, and often they are connected with great structures, with monumental ruins, with the building of impressive works attributed to a race of giants who must have raised them. And again they are gone, or nearly gone, a vanished or vanishing race, displaced by ordinary humanity, remembered only in legend. The giants of the world's traditions are a strikingly consistent phenomenon, an ancient race of great beings associated with the deep past and with monumental works now vanished, remembered everywhere. Feel the force of this because it is the strongest form of the giant mystery. If giants were purely a local legend confined to one tradition, we might dismiss them easily. But they are not local. They are worldwide. Peoples across the entire globe who never shared their stories all remember giants, all tell of an ancient race of great beings who came before. Surely, the believer says, this worldwide recurrence points to something real. Surely so many cultures would not independently remember giants unless there had truly been giants, a real ancient race of great beings, remembered by all the peoples descended from those who knew them. The universal memory of giants, the believer argues, is the echo of a real universal past, a time when giants truly walked the earth. That is the case in its strongest form, and it deserves to be felt. Now let us examine it honestly, because the worldwide recurrence of giants, striking as it is, has powerful explanations that require no literal race of giants at all, and understanding these explanations is essential to weighing the whole subject fairly. The first and perhaps most powerful explanation lies buried in the ground, in the bones. Consider what happens when ancient peoples, without any knowledge of paleontology, without any concept of extinct species or deep geological time, encounter large fossil bones in the earth. Across the world, the ground holds the remains of enormous creatures, the bones of great prehistoric animals, mammoths and mastodons and giant ground sloths and dinosaurs and countless other large beasts whose fossilized bones have been weathering out of the earth throughout human history. And to a people with no framework for understanding these bones, no concept of extinct megafauna or dinosaurs, what would these enormous remains suggest? Giants, great bones, far larger than any human or familiar animal, would naturally be understood as the remains of a race of giants, great beings who once walked the earth and left their mighty bones behind. The skull of a large prehistoric animal, the massive thigh bone of a mammoth, could easily be taken for the remains of a giant human or a giant being, and such misidentifications genuinely happened throughout history, across cultures. Large fossil bones were understood as the bones of giants and became evidence in the eyes of ancient peoples for the reality of the ancient giant race. The bones of the deep past, misread, became the giants of legend. This is a genuine and powerful explanation, and it accounts beautifully for the worldwide recurrence, because large fossil bones are found all over the world, everywhere, and so everywhere peoples encountering them without the modern knowledge to identify them would independently reach the same conclusion, that great beings, giants, once existed, and here are their bones. The universal presence of large fossils in the earth naturally produces the universal legend of giants in culture after culture, without any need for a real race of giant humans. The giants are real in a sense. They are the great creatures of the prehistoric past, but they are not giant humans, and the legend arises from misinterpreting their remains. The second explanation lies in the monuments, the great ancient structures found across the world. Everywhere, there are impressive ancient works, massive stone structures, megalithic monuments, enormous ruins whose builders were forgotten, whose methods of construction seemed, to later peoples, beyond ordinary human capability. And confronted with such works, with great stones moved and raised by forgotten hands, later peoples naturally asked, who built these? And a natural answer, again and again, was giants. A race of great beings, mightier than ordinary humans, who could have raised these enormous stones, who built the monuments of the deep past. Across the world, impressive ancient structures were attributed to giants, taken as evidence of a vanished race of great builders. And this, too, is worldwide, because impressive ancient ruins are found across the globe, and everywhere they could inspire the same conclusion that giants built them. The monuments of the forgotten past, like the bones of the prehistoric creatures, became evidence for the giants. The third explanation lies in the human mind and its ways of remembering, in the natural tendency to magnify the past and its inhabitants. There is a deep and universal human inclination to imagine the past as greater than the present, to remember earlier ages as times of greater beings, greater deeds, greater stature. The ancestors, the heroes of old, the people of the former age, are remembered as larger, mightier, more powerful than the diminished people of the present, and formidable enemies, earlier inhabitants of a land, are naturally magnified in memory into giants, great and terrible beings who had to be overcome. This tendency to magnify the past and its inhabitants, to remember the ancients as giants, is a deep and universal feature of the human imagination, and it naturally produces, across cultures, the memory of an ancient race of great beings larger than the people of today. Put these explanations together, and the worldwide recurrence of giants, so striking at first, becomes not merely explicable, but almost expected. Everywhere, the ground holds great fossil bones, naturally misread as the remains of giants. Everywhere, there are impressive ancient monuments, naturally attributed to a race of giant builders. And everywhere, the human mind magnifies the past and its inhabitants into great beings, giants of a former age. Given all of this, the surprising thing would be if giants were not a worldwide legend. Of course, peoples everywhere remember giants. They found the bones, they saw the monuments, and they carried the universal human tendency to imagine the ancients as great. The worldwide recurrence of giants does not require a real race of giant humans. It flows naturally from the real bones in the ground, the real monuments on the land, and the real workings of the human mind everywhere. So the honest verdict on the giants of the world is this: the worldwide recurrence of giant legends is real and remarkable, a genuine phenomenon. but it does not point to a literal worldwide race of giant humans, for which there is no physical evidence, no giant human skeletons, no remains of a race of 10-foot people, and against which stands everything we know of human biology. Instead, it flows from causes that are themselves real and worldwide. The fossil bones of great prehistoric creatures, the monumental ruins of forgotten builders, and the universal human tendency to magnify the past. The giants are real as a phenomenon, real as a worldwide legend, but the legend arises from misread bones and forgotten monuments and the magnifying mind, not from a real race of giants walking the earth. And yet let us hold the honest residue, as we always do. Granting all these explanations, there remains something worth acknowledging. It is genuinely true that there was human height variation in the past, that there were unusually tall individuals, that some populations were taller than others, and that real large bones and real impressive monuments and real formidable peoples lie behind some of the legends. The giants are not simply nothing. They are the magnified, mythologized memory of real things, real bones, real ruins, real tall people, real awe at the deep past. The legend has roots in reality, even if the reality is not a literal race of 10-foot beings. And the very universality of the giant legend, whatever its cause, tells us something true about humanity, about our shared ways of encountering the deep past, our shared awe before the great bones and the great ruins, our shared tendency to people the former world with beings greater than ourselves. Which brings us back at last to Og and to the end of his story and to the meaning of the whole long tradition of the giants. We have traced Og through the text and the legend and the modern speculation. We have followed the bloodline of the Nephilim and widened our view to the giants of the whole world. Now it is time to draw it all together and to ask what it means that the age of giants ended when it did, and how and what the truth beneath the legend might be. Let us turn to the end of the age of giants. Every age ends. And in the tradition we have been following, the age of giants, that long and terrible epoch when great beings walked the earth, came to an end in stages, winding down across the generations, until the last giant fell and the world was left to ordinary humanity. Og was a crucial moment in that ending, but he was not quite the final one. To understand the true end of the age of giants, we have to trace the whole long twilight of the giants, from Og to the last remnants, and ask what it means that the stories end the way they do. Let us follow the giants down to their final extinction and gather the meaning of the whole long tradition. Recall the arc we have traced. The giants began before the flood with the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God, the mighty ones of the corrupted ancient world. The flood came to destroy them, to end the age of giants in a drowned and cleansed world. But the age of giants did not end there. It was prolonged, carried across the flood in the tradition by the survival of Og, the last of the Rephaim clinging to the ark, bearing the ancient bloodline into the world after the deluge. And so the giants persisted, the Rephaim and the Anakim and the other clans, into the age of Moses and the conquest of the Promised Land. The age of giants, which should have ended with the flood, was extended by generations, a long twilight of the ancient race in the lands of Canaan and beyond. And then began the true ending, the final winding down. It began with Og himself at Edrei, when the last king of the Rephaim fell in battle, and his people were left without a survivor. That was the end of the Rephaim, the extinction of the greatest of the giant clans, the fall of the last giant king. But the giants were not entirely gone. Other clans, other remnants lingered. The conquest of the Promised Land involved the displacement and defeat of the giant peoples, the Anakim driven out and destroyed, the giant races cleared from the land, generation by generation, battle by battle. The age of giants was ending, but it ended slowly, remnant by remnant, as the giant peoples were overcome and the land passed to ordinary humanity. And the last flicker, the final famous giant, came generations after Og, in the time of David, Goliath. We began this whole journey by contrasting Og with Goliath, noting that Og was the greater and older giant, the forgotten king who dwarfed the famous champion. And now we can see where Goliath truly fits at the very end of the long twilight, the last famous giant of the tradition, a straggler, a remnant, one of the last of the ancient race, appearing when the age of giants was almost entirely over. Goliath and the other giants of Gath, his kindred, the last large warriors descended from the old stock, were the final remnants, the last flickers of the giant bloodline. And Goliath's fall before the shepherd boy David and his sling was, in a sense, the last great giant story, the final famous chapter in the long tradition of the giants. After Goliath, the giants effectively vanish from the story. The age of giants, which began before the flood, ends at last in the valley where David faced the champion of Gath. Look at the whole arc now from the height of the tradition. The Nephilim before the flood, the survival across the deluge through Og, the Rephaim and the Anakim of the Promised Land, the fall of Og at Edrei, the clearing of the giant clans in the conquest, and finally Goliath, the last famous giant, falling before David. It is a complete arc, the rise and the long decline and the final extinction of the giants, a race that began in the corrupted world before the flood and dwindled across the generations to a last few remnants until the final giant fell and the age was over. And Og stands at the crucial hinge of that arc, the survivor who carried the giants across the flood, the last king of the greatest giant clan, whose fall began the true ending. There is a meaning in the shape of this arc, in the way the age of giants ends, and it is worth drawing out. Notice that the giants belong always to the past, to an earlier and more terrible age, and that their story is one of decline and disappearance. The giants are never the future. They are always the vanishing remnant of an older world, being cleared away to make room for ordinary humanity, for the ordinary human future. The age of giants ends because it must end, because the giants belong to the old world, the corrupted world, the world before, and their extinction is the passing of that old world and the beginning of the ordinary human age. The end of the giants is the end of the mythic past and the beginning of ordinary history. And this points to something deep about what the giants mean in the tradition, and perhaps in the human imagination more broadly. The giants represent the mythic past, the age of great and terrible beings, the time before the ordinary world, and their gradual extinction represents the passing of that mythic age, the transition from a world of giants and marvels and great terrible beings to the ordinary human world we know. The age of giants ends because the mythic age ends, because the world moves from the time of legend to the time of history, from the age of the great ancient beings to the age of ordinary human life. Og and the giants belong to the vanishing mythic past, and their end is the birth of the ordinary present. Now let us gather the honest truth beneath the whole tradition, drawing together everything we have examined. What was the age of giants, really? At the level of the tradition, it is a rich and coherent mythology, the story of the great beings who came before, from the Nephilim to Goliath, a whole arc of rise and decline woven through the scriptures and the legends. At the level of history, we have found that there is no evidence for a literal race of giants, no giant skeletons, no remains of 10-foot peoples, and that the giant traditions likely arose from a combination of real things magnified and mythologized, great fossil bones misread, impressive monuments attributed to giant builders, formidable earlier peoples remembered as greater than they were, and the universal human tendency to imagine the past as an age of great beings. The age of giants, in the honest reading, is not a literal historical epoch of 10-foot people, but a mythologized memory, rich and meaningful, built from real materials, the bones and the ruins and the magnifying mind, into the grand tradition of the giants. And Og, at the center of it all, Og is the tradition's giant in its fullest form. He is the biblical king, the last of the Rephaim, a genuine figure of the text. He is the legendary survivor of the flood, the keystone that holds the giant tradition together, resolving its deepest contradiction. He is the crucial link in the bloodline, the bridge across the deluge. And he is, in the honest reading, a mythologized figure, built perhaps around a real memory, a real monument, a real place, but elaborated by the tradition into the last great giant king, the survivor of the drowned world. Og is the giant tradition concentrated into a single figure, text and legend and meaning all together, the last king of the vanishing mythic age. The age of giants ended in the tradition when the last giant fell. And in history, the age of giants is not so much an epoch that ended as a mythology that we can now understand, a way the human imagination gave shape to the deep past, peopling it with the great beings whose bones lay in the ground and whose monuments stood on the land. The giants were always the beings of the former world, and their passing was always the passing of the mythic age into the ordinary one. Og was the last king of that vanishing world, and his fall, and the fall of the giants after him, marks, in the tradition, the end of the age of giants and the beginning of the world we know. And so we come at last to the end of our journey and to the figure who has led us through it all, the forgotten giant king, larger than Goliath, older than the flood, the last of the Rephaim. Let us gather what we have found and ask finally why Og haunts the imagination as he does, and what the last giant king still has to tell us. We began with a bed of iron 13 feet long, described in one of the oldest books in the world, built to hold the body of a king who was also a giant. And from that single strange detail, we have followed a story that reaches back before the flood and forward to the shepherd boy David, a story of an entire race of giants and their long twilight, all concentrated in one forgotten figure, Og, king of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim. Now, at the end of our journey, let us gather what we have found and ask what the last giant king still has to tell us. We have traveled through 3 layers, and it is worth remembering them one final time, because keeping them clear has been the whole discipline of this journey. There was the text, the biblical Og, a genuine figure of the scriptures, the king of Bashan, the last of the Rephaim, defeated by Moses at Edrei, remembered across Numbers and Deuteronomy and Joshua and the Psalms. There was the legend, the rabbinic Og, the survivor of the flood, clinging to the ark, fed by Noah through an opening, the bridge across the deluge, the keystone of the whole giant tradition. And there was the modern speculation, the Og of the Nephilim bloodline, enlisted into a grand theory of a hidden lineage of giants threaded through history. 3 Ogs, 3 layers, text and legend and dream, each built upon the one before, each fascinating, each distinct. And we have tried at every step to be clear about which one we were standing in, because that clarity is the difference between understanding the tradition and being swept away by it. And we have been honest about the evidence, as we always must be. There is no physical proof of a literal race of giants, no 13-foot skeletons, no remains of the Rephaim, no bones of 10-foot kings. The bed of Og may well have been a great basalt monument, a sarcophagus or a megalith transformed by the tradition into the bed of a giant. The giant races likely arose from real things magnified, great fossil bones misread, impressive monuments attributed to giant builders, formidable peoples remembered as greater than they were. The survival across the flood is legend, born to solve a contradiction in the text. The persistent bloodline is speculation beyond the evidence. All of this we have said plainly, because the honest reading is part of the respect we owe the subject. And yet, having said all of that, why does Og haunt the imagination as he does? Why does the last giant king hold us, more perhaps than even the famous Goliath? I think the answer lies in everything that makes Og strange, in the very things the legends gave him. Goliath is a giant, but he is only a giant, a great enemy felled by a hero, a single dramatic story. Og is something more. Og is a survivor. Og is the last of his kind. Og is the being who outlived his own world, who clung to the ark while everything he knew drowned beneath him, who carried the memory of a vanished age into a world that had moved on, who reigned as the final king of a dying race in the twilight of the giants. There is a loneliness to Og, a grandeur and a sadness that Goliath never had. He is the last of the Rephaim, the last of the old world, the final relic of the age before, holding on, reigning on, until the story is finally ready to let him go. That image of the last survivor of a vanished world is one of the most powerful in all of human imagination, and it is why Og endures. He is the being who should not still exist, who belongs to an age that has passed, who lingers on as the final witness to a drowned world. When Moses faced Og at Edrei, he was not just facing a giant king. He was facing the last living link to the age before the flood, the final ember of the ancient world, the last of the great beings who had walked the earth in the beginning. And when Og fell, something more than a king died. An age died. The last door to the old world closed. The age of giants, prolonged for generations by his impossible survival, finally, truly ended. And there is a deeper resonance still in what Og represents that reaches beyond the tradition into something universal. Og is the past that will not quite die, the old world that lingers into the new, the ancient thing that survives into an age that has no place for it. Every culture knows this figure in some form, the last of an old race, the final survivor of a vanished age, the relic of a world that is gone. Og is that figure in his most dramatic form, the giant who outlived the flood, the last king of the giants, the final witness to the world before. And his fall is the moment the old world finally releases its grip, the moment the mythic past finally gives way to the ordinary present, the moment the age of giants ends and the age of ordinary humanity begins. So what do we make of the last giant king in the end? He is text and legend and dream woven together. He is a genuine figure of the scriptures, elaborated by tradition into a survivor of the drowned world, enlisted by modern speculation into a hidden bloodline. He is, in the honest reading, a mythologized figure built from real materials into the last great giant of the tradition. And he is, whatever his historical reality, one of the most haunting figures the human imagination ever produced, the last of the Rephaim, the survivor of the flood, the giant who outlived his world, the last king of the age of giants. The bed of iron, 13 feet long, was offered by the text as proof of the giant who once slept in it. And whether it was a real bed or a great dark monument, whether Og was a real king or a mythologized memory, the bed still does its work all these thousands of years later. It still makes us imagine the being who needed it. It still makes us wonder about the age of giants, the world before, the great beings who came and went. It still points across the centuries to the last giant king and to the vanished world he carried on his back across the drowning of everything until the day he fell and the age of giants ended at last. What do you believe? Was there ever an age of giants, a time when great beings truly walked the earth, remembered in the bed of Og and the bones in the ground and the legends of every land? Or were the giants always a dream, a way of peopling the deep past with beings greater than ourselves, built from misread bones and forgotten monuments and the magnifying power of memory? Was Og a real king or a legend grown around a great dark stone? And if the giants were only ever a dream, why did every people on earth dream them? Tell us in the comments. This is a mystery we will never tire of exploring. If this journey into the world of the last giant king changed the way you see the giants of the ancient world and the strange haunting figure who outlived the flood, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more of the mysteries that lie buried in the deep past waiting to be found.